Hey there, everybody. Checking in. Much more on the ball this week since we are just finished up with the Coleridge unit and now moving into a midterm unit. It's hard to believe it's midterm in the semester, but it is more or less. So anyway, lots of interesting comments then that people had about the Coleridge assignment, which was to read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, one of his most famous, if not his most famous, poems. And it's kind of typically Coleridgean, if you want to say that, because it's so strange, which he's kind of known for. It has this, in fact, especially in its earliest form of publication, even more so, but it has this kind of archaic, otherworldly feel to it, even though in terms of the way it operates as poetry, it was very, not even contemporary, but kind of revolutionary or forward-looking. So it has this eerie mix of old-timiness, but also kind of spaciness at the same time. Anyway, so we were looking at that poem with the marginal glosses, which are so strange because they bear this kind of ironic relationship to the text that they're supposed to help, right? And again, as I made note of in the unit, the glosses were added by Coleridge, of course, even though they're meant to kind of look like and act like an outside editor would read the poem, not understand it, and then add these glosses. They were added like a decade after the poem's original publication, which a lot of people reacted negatively to because it was, as many of you found, confusing. It's hard to follow. You don't really know what's going on. It has both this sort of definite but also, again, kind of confusing setting. And then the whole poem itself is told as a frame tale with the story that the mariner, in later years tells these people at a wedding. So the action of the poem is embedded in this act of it being told. Coleridge also used a lot of archaic spellings and word choices in the original publication, which people reacted against, because it was already confusing, and then to deal with these words that were basically unknown made it even more difficult. So I think, to be perfectly honest, and I don't like to say this up front because it's kind of giving it away, and this is my interpretation, so that it's not the only one necessarily, but the poem is really about how we desire so badly to make sense of things, to make meaning out of things. And so it's really that act of storytelling that the mariner, tells the wedding guest this tale. It introduces the act of telling, but also, of course, the act of hearing. And so the wedding guest himself is much like us, trying to make sense of the tale that the mariner tells. And so, as many of you said, it's confusing, but, and this is the frustrating part, it's really intentionally confusing. And I don't think it's intentionally confusing in terms of what happens. Like, there's a mariner, he goes on a journey, they meet death in life, all of this stuff. It's weird and creepy, but it's relatively easy to follow if you just take the time to kind of figure out what's going on. What's really confusing is why things happen, especially with the killing of the albatross, right? That famous, maybe the most famous literary bird next to Poe's raven that we've got. That act is so unreasonable, right? There's no sense to it. Why does it happen? Why does the mariner do that, And so everything that follows then from that is kind of the process of just how awful and destructive that act was. I mean, basically everybody on the ship dies except for him. Hundreds of people were told. And so he survives, and they're like, no, like of all the people that should have been dead, it should have been him. It doesn't make any sense. The world's unfair. That could be a good caption, or summary for that poem. And so the poem is kind of confusing because we're invited to work out in some logical way why he kills the albatross, and then what his punishment is, and how things kind of get resolved. But the poem is really about how the world doesn't always conform to the kind of rules that we'd like it to. So it comes off as confusing, but I think that's precisely Coleridge's intention, is to really question the way we make sense of the world and things that happen in it. One of the ways is through storytelling, so that becomes part of the poem. And of course, we're invited to see maybe the punishment that the narrator, or the mariner, who's also the narrator, that he receives for this act is having compulsively to tell the story, almost as if in doing so he can somehow work out for himself why things happened the way they did. And you'll also notice towards the end of the poem, we get this very, what hopefully seems like kind of a too easy moral. Like, this horrible thing happened, hundreds of people died, but I learned my lesson. And here's the lesson. And he gives us this very pat moral about, basically, as Blake would say, if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. Basically, just have faith and everything will be all right. Which is BS. The poem has just taught us that. And so I think intentionally, again, that moral, the ending of the story, is meant to be not very satisfying. It's satisfying in as much as it's, again, just sort of pat and it ties up the loose ends, but it really doesn't explain much. And it certainly doesn't explain this terrible thing that's happened, which is, the shooting of the albatross and then the fallout from that. Are you really satisfied with the ending of that poem? I hope not. And so I think Coleridge's point was largely missed by his readership, who he, I think, satirizes by adding those marginal glosses that really just add another level of trying to explain the poem that is designed to be inexplicable, at least in terms of the motivation for, what happens and also the consequence. Those two things are sort of called into question. And of course, all of that, the idea of the poem is wrapped in this very strange story about a strange guy who goes on a strange trip. So there's just a lot of that strangeness going on too. So the irony for me is always that because readers, contemporary and as well as Coleridge's own time period, they struggle with comprehension in the poem, so they actually find the glosses kind of useful at parts, just like a Cliff's Notes. Even though, as one person commented here, there's very clear types of glosses. There's the helpful ones or the kind of explanatory ones, but then there's sort of the ludicrous ones as well that try to make connections between the poem and almost like this scholarly apparatus. That's by doing the research, that's the way we'll figure out how the world works, which again is exactly what Coleridge is kind of making fun of and calling into question. So anyway, many students, many contemporary readers come out of that essay or the poem feeling like the glosses were actually very helpful, and thank God he added them, otherwise that poem would be truly impenetrable. Well, ironically, I think Coleridge really was intending to kind of make fun of the very impulse to make perfect sense of things in that way. And so our use of the glosses in the way that they are in fact most useful for explaining the poem was precisely what Coleridge was kind of satirizing, like this editorial voice comes in to explain things for us. Coleridge is making fun of that, but actually it's sort of helpful. So you kind of have to submit yourself to being the butt of the joke, if you want to put it that way. But anyway, just one of those poems that's so, like, we could spend easily almost a course on Coleridge and a huge chunk of it on that poem, because it has so many dimensions beyond just the intrinsically strange story that it tells. Kubla Khan is very much the same way, which I had you look at. Many of Coleridge's works contain this, they're sort of multi-genre, even though we usually think of him as a poet and his works as poetry. So the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is the text of poetry, right? The verse lines. And then there's this gloss on the side. I think if pressed, Coleridge would admit that the poem or the work is actually all of that stuff put together. The same way with Kubla Khan, if you look at that, there's the title, which is itself kind of wishy-washy. It's Kubla Khan or a vision and a dream, and it's a fragment, so we're not really sure. Like I said before, Coleridge never wanted to commit to anything exactly, so. And then there's the preface. There were notes added later by Coleridge that kind of explain the poem and apologize for its being there at the same point. He quotes from himself within that preface or that, head note, whatever you want to call it. So there's allusion there to other lines of poetry that he's written. Then there's the lines of verse itself. And in fact, they all kind of tell the story of the problem of composition, the problem of creativity. So again, when we talk about Kubla Khan or Rime of the Ancient Mariner as a poem, it's actually, both of those are really more like multi-genre works that include the gloss, notes, footnotes, headnotes, prefaces, so prose, obviously the lines of poetry themselves, but really the entirety of the work needs all of those pieces together. Which is why, for me, I said before that Coleridge is really one of my favorite authors to study because, like Blake, who is my favorite, they're just so weird. Not as people necessarily, although that too, but the works that they produce just have all of these kind of oddities going on in them. In many cases intentional, even though it's not intentional in the sense that Coleridge sits down and thinks, I'm going to do this and that will produce this result. So there was a cause and effect thing going on. I think Blake, Coleridge, people like that were much more interested just in the cause part of it. Like, what if I did this? Let's find out what happens. So it's intentional in the sense that the doing is intentional, but it's certainly not like there was a predicted outcome that they knew that they could achieve by doing this. So intention is sort of funny that way. But anyway, Blake and Coleridge are just strange people that produced very strange and compelling works, I think. Okay, so we move away from Coleridge, which makes me sad, and away from the Romantic period generally, which makes me even sadder because it's absolutely my area of specialty and my favorite, and which comes first, you know, probably the favorite part. Precisely because, to go to the PS I'd ask about in Unit 7, it's no coincidence really that rock music and heavy metal especially, but rock generally, share so much in common with the Romantic period because it was a period of revolution, rebellion, fighting against authority, trying to make things better, even if it was just in this combative kind of way, always seeing the next possibility. It was a very hopeful age. And while heavy metal isn't necessarily hopeful in that sense, it is absolutely rebellious, nonconformist, all that stuff. So it was super attractive to me as an undergrad student, you know, almost from the get-go. It was just a natural fit, and it still is to this day. So for a brief period of decades, the Romantic period was maybe the shortest one we cover, but just absolutely exploding with possibilities and the heights of hope and the depths of pessimism and despair. It was like it was everything. It had everything going on in a very compressed time frame. So it was this really intense kind of literary moment in the Western tradition. Anyway, we will get then to the Victorian period, which is very different, largely because, as we'll discuss, it was no single change like the idea of revolution, let's say. There was no single social change that really gripped people's attention, but really the pace of change itself, things changed so fast that that really became the preoccupation, is how do we negotiate a world that is slipping away from us before we can even get pen on paper. And so a lot of people, I think, are attracted to the Victorian period precisely because it initiates that problem that is so present for us today, just the pace of change. And while technology, the way we know it, didn't exist in the Victorian period, the fundamental problem of the fluidity and rapidity of the movement of information and ideas, it really starts in the Victorian period. Or if it doesn't start there, because it's hard to name a starting place for these things, it reaches this kind of critical mass, you might say. But anyway, we have a nice stopping point here in Unit 8, a little rest period, a midterm essay that you're writing. The details are, fairly well laid out here. You're choosing a theme to talk about in a fully developed essay that you're posting, and then you're reading other people's. But it does give us a nice kind of vantage point to look back, see where we've been, see what we've covered, think a little more broadly, outside of just focusing on one work or one author, to see some connections. So there's a number of different options here, kind of thematic, in nature. But I would also suggest that if there is something that has been intriguing for you or something that you've noticed as a kind of running theme that we've hit on, or basically just something that I haven't provided here as a topic to write on, then by all means, you're invited to write on it. The only thing I would ask is that you contact me first, right, before doing it, just to make sure that it's on the right track, and just let me know what your idea is. The scope should obviously be about the same as what's provided here. So remember that this is a response essay, so you have a clear intro, thesis, developed body paragraphs with direct quotation from the readings, and then a nice conclusion. We're still relatively informal in the sense that you don't have to do any research. There's no works cited or any of that kind of stuff. So really focus on the message that you're writing, not all that extraneous or extra stuff. As always, if you have questions, if you do want to pursue something that's a different topic, by all means be in touch with me, and I will talk to everybody soon.